All right. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Michael Scanlon. I'm the Director of Industry Affairs, and I want to thank all of you for being here at our Sustaining Members Lunch today. And I further want to thank you for all the support you've given the association throughout the year and throughout the years in most cases. So if you could give yourselves a round of applause, thank you very much. We have a very special guest speaker today, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Dunford, USMC. Hoorah! And now it is my pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the Association of the United States Army, General Carter F. Ham.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks all of you for joining us. And I'd like to introduce the immediate past president of the Association of the United States Army, General Gordon R. Sullivan. There's lots of dignitaries here and lots of senior officials, so I'll just say welcome all. I would make a specific comment that Secretary Fanning was planning to be here, but he's doing something more important, and that's he's going to a dignified return ceremony at Dover. So one of the things we should always keep in our minds are those women and men who continue to serve and sacrifice for our nation. And Secretary Fanning's presence at that dignified return ceremony will be very, very important. But we are very thankful for all of you who are here. This is an important event for us. There are over 500 sustaining members of the Association of the United States Army, and it is you, the sustaining members, who are our lifeblood and keep us afloat, provide the intellectual energy for our annual meeting and for many of our activities that go on throughout the year. And we take very seriously our responsibility at the association to continue to develop and maintain the close bonds of professionalism between the Army and the defense industry that supports the best Army on the planet. This annual meeting, as many of you know, has a number of professional development opportunities. I hope you've had an opportunity to take advantage of those. Those will continue on after the lunch. I would especially note the Innovators Corner, which is in Hall C. It's a great opportunity to see some of the emerging technologies that Secretary Fanning spoke with us about on Monday. And a second note, a special call out to the American Freedom Foundation, which has once again produced a Veterans Hiring Pavilion. It's in the back of Hall A this year. That includes a number of you, our sustaining members, involved in the high priority mission, the right mission of hiring more and more veterans as we go forward. So again, welcome, thank you. Please enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back up shortly. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, again, good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and we'll proceed with this afternoon's program. Again, thank you all so very much for joining us. We have the great opportunity this afternoon at this luncheon for our sustaining members to present the John W. Dixon Medal, which is in recognition of one of our sustaining members' invaluable contributions to the United States Army and to the nation. May I ask General McQuistion, our Vice President for Membership and Meetings, and Ms. Marilyn Houston, the award recipient, to please join me on the stage. Ms. Houston, as you know, leads Lockheed Martin, which has made countless significant contributions to the Army, with improvements in aviation, missile defense, and numerous other valuable and indispensable capabilities. For those in the Army who may not know, she has Army DNA. She was born in Junction City, Kansas, the home of Fort Riley in the Army's 1st Infantry Division, a unit that happens to be a little bit important to me and to General Sullivan. So we're very, very glad to do that. So without further ado, it's my great privilege to announce Mrs. Houston as our Dixon Award winner. Michael Scanlon, please.
The John W. Dixon Medal is awarded to a distinguished member of industry who has made a particularly significant contribution to the defense of the nation. The Dixon Medal is named in honor of its first recipient, Mr. John W. Dixon, a distinguished executive and an outstanding representative of the American defense industry. This year's Dixon Award recipient is Marilyn Houston, Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of the Lockheed Martin Corporation. Over the course of her more than 30 years with Lockheed Martin, Houston has done a great deal to benefit the United States Army and the men and women that serve within its ranks, whether through strengthening partnerships between industry and the public sector or bolstering capabilities of our armed forces. Houston has helped make our soldiers and our nation safer. Under Houston's leadership, Lockheed Martin made the Joining Forces Impact Pledge in 2014, committing $25 million in funding over 5 years to support active duty service members, veterans, military families, and caregivers. The company has also made significant contributions to foster education, particularly related to science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, donating more than $30 million to the U.S. Service Museums, including $10 million for the National Museum of the United States Army campaign. Lockheed Martin has also made significant efforts to bolster employment among veterans in partnership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Hiring Our Heroes program. They have helped the organization to host hundreds of hiring fairs across the U.S., Europe, and Japan, resulting in more than 25,000 new hires of veterans and military spouses. For her outstanding contributions to the defense of the nation and the women and men who serve in uniform, the Association of the United States Army proudly presents the John W. Dixon Award to Marilyn Houston.
Well, General Ham, thank you very much. Trustees, officers, members of the Association of the United States Army, thank you very much for this very prestigious honor. And I'm delighted to accept it on behalf of the men and women of Lockheed Martin. At Lockheed Martin, we have the highest respect for the work of AUSA. We know that what you do in your leadership and your support and what it means to our American soldiers all around the world. That's why Lockheed Martin is proud to have been a sustaining member of the AUSA for over 50 years. I'd also like to thank General Dunford and General Milley. Thank you so much for your outstanding leadership, especially at this pivotal time in our history. And most important, I'd like to thank all the soldiers and the other service members that are here in the room with us today for the incredible sacrifices that you have made for our nation and for our allies around the world. The John A. Dixon Award is known for going to some of the nation's most highly respected leaders who have dedicated their careers to supporting our national defense and the men and women who fight for our freedoms. And I consider it a great privilege to be an industry partner in this shared effort for our security and our global peace. Lockheed Martin's 98,000 women and men work side by side with soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to make sure that they have the technologies that they need to protect America's interest at home and abroad. It's their ingenuity, their dedication, and their hard work that has made it possible for me to be here today to accept this honor on their behalf. I want to use this opportunity today to challenge all of us in this room to see how we can help to close the gap between the increasing burden being placed on our men and women in uniform and the declining resources that they have to carry out increasingly complex and essential missions. I believe that even in this very complex political environment, that we can achieve this goal. To achieve this important goal, we must come together to focus on 3 key areas of action. First, we must identify common challenges and advocate for solutions. In the battle to help our nation's policymakers understand the importance of stable defense funding, organizations like AUSA are serving as a force multiplier. You bring together soldiers, veterans, Army civilians, family members, and industry to speak loudly and clearly with one voice and advocate on behalf of the best interest of our service members. Let's strive to broaden that coalition and educate the American people on the importance of investing in our national security. Second, today's threat environment demands that we prepare for the challenges that our military will face in the future. It's imperative that our nation maintain absolute technological superiority over our nation's enemies, and we can do it. The U.S. defense industry has the ingenuity necessary to lead the world in critical and emerging fields like autonomy, data analytics, connectivity, and material science. With increased investment and sustained collaboration between government and industry, we can ensure that our industry's expertise is applied to the challenges our service members will face on the battlefield of tomorrow, whether on land, sea, air, or cyberspace. Finally, we must work together to develop the workforce of the future. While adequate budgets are essential, the most critical asset for our military and for our defense industry are our people. The defense industry needs employees with the science, technology, engineering, and math skills necessary to develop solutions for our customers' most complex challenges. And the Army needs soldiers who can operate and maintain the highly sophisticated technologies that we develop together. We must work to show young people the exciting opportunities they can pursue through a career in STEM, whether in an Army uniform or as an engineer in the defense industry. So each of us has a critical role to play on all 3 of these fronts, and I believe by working together, we can and will make a lasting difference. Thank you once again for this prestigious award and for your service to our nation. At Lockheed Martin, we sincerely appreciate the trust that you place in us as your industry partner. It's a trust that we do not take lightly, and it is why we are proud to work with all of you to build the Army of the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Ms. Houston. We are proud that you have joined us, and we're very proud of this partnership that the Association of the United States Army has with Lockheed Martin, as with all of our sustaining members. It's now my privilege to introduce our guest speaker for this afternoon, but I have to tell you that I had a bit of an uncomfortable lunch. I'm from Cleveland, and I sit in between 3 Bostonites. Now, I'll concede there is an NFL game scheduled for Cleveland on Sunday. As some of you have heard the Chief of Staff Army speak yesterday, it is the return of the Exalted One. I think it could be a long day for the Cleveland Browns, so I'll concede that one to you. But there's a baseball game tomorrow in Cleveland, and I think we got a much better shot at that one, so we'll see how that goes. So for my 3 Boston friends, I really hope you lose tomorrow. I got the microphone, Chief. General Joe Dunford, 19th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You all know the position. The Chairman serves as the nation's highest-ranking military officer and the principal military advisor to the Commander-in-Chief. to the Secretary of Defense and to the National Security Council. You can read General Dunford's bio and you can see all the things that he's done, and you come away saying, well, of course, he's the chairman. He's had all the right qualifying positions, background, and experience, but that's not who Joe Dunford is. Joe Dunford is physically and morally courageous. He is a man of strong faith, of deep background, and strength of character. But I would also tell you he is humble, and I think is the very embodiment of what we often refer to in the armed forces as the servant leader. He feels his responsibility deeply each and every day to ensure the men and women of our armed forces are as ready as they possibly can be to meet the requirements of our nation's national security objectives. So it's my great privilege to honor my friend and welcome General Joe Dunford to the stage.
Hey, thanks, Carter, for that introduction. And I would tell you, as the former deputy J3 when General Ham was the J3, Carter, everything you said about me, you must have been mirror imaging, because that's what I would say about you. But more importantly, I'm actually pretty proud to stand up here and say I'm Ham trained. But if you think you're a little bit uncomfortable at lunch today, wait till tomorrow morning. General Milley, Chief, the Army's lucky to have you at the helm, and I feel fortunate to have you as a partner on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You're the right leader at the right time. And General Sullivan, the pride of Quincy, Massachusetts. There you go. You know, I'm going to just say something that I hadn't really thought about until I arrived today and had a chance to talk to General Sullivan beforehand, and I've seen so many of the distinguished former chiefs here and Army leadership. And this is really directed at the active duty people that are here. If you're looking for an example of how to conduct yourself when you're a retired general officer, if you're looking for a way to continue to serve, if you're looking for a way to continue to enhance the credibility of our institution, you just have to look at the way General Gordon Sullivan has conducted himself for not just his almost 40 years in active duty, but the 10 or 15 years that he's been continuing to serve our Army since he retired. And if you want to know what right looks like when you retire, and again, I'm speaking to those still wearing a uniform, that's what right looks like. And all the soldiers in the room, thanks for what you do. There are a number of friends here, and I could probably eat up the 20 minutes that I've been given just by going around the room and mentioning them by name, and I won't do that. Before I begin, though, I do want to once again congratulate Marilyn for her recognition. She outlined pretty well the challenges that face us, and I know that one of the things that this week is all about is developing a better relationship, a closer relationship between the services, in this case our Army, and industry. And frankly, I think at this particular time, again, another model, what Marilyn has done at Lockheed Martin, and I know this from a previous life as a service chief, has been exactly that, is to try to develop a good relationship. We're all going to live on a fixed income. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that means we got to make the right choices. That means we have to have a shared understanding of the challenges that face us. That means we have to have a shared understanding of what our soldiers need to be successful. And I think what Lockheed Martin is doing in that regard is a model. So well-deserved recognition, Marilyn, for you. I am honored to be here today, and I mean that sincerely. And I'm honored every day to represent our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. It's the best part of what I do. And this afternoon, what I thought I would do is just share with you a few thoughts about how I see the strategic landscape right now, but more importantly, the implications for the joint force of that strategic landscape. And along the way, I think I'll probably make a few comments about the implications of the strategic landscape today for our Army as well. I had the opportunity to read some of the coverage of the speakers earlier this week and some of the dialogue that's taken place, and I think that what I'm about to say is complementary to much of the conversation that you've had Monday and Tuesday and earlier this morning. Before I do that, I want to talk about readiness, and the Chief is absolutely right to make readiness his #1 priority. Our Army and our joint force has to be ready to fight and win across the spectrum of conflict. And we've learned from history that crisis and contingency are typically a come-as-you-are affair. General Sullivan frequently reminded us of that when he was the Chief of Staff in the Army. And you remember he talked about Task Force Smith quite a bit when he was the Chief. When the North Korean People's Army charged across the 38th parallel in June of 1950, and shortly thereafter, we were fighting on the ground, in a place, at a time, under conditions we simply didn't expect. And I think we all remember the initial results of that were disastrous. I like to remind people who have a high confidence about assumptions on when, where, and how we'll fight the next fight. I like to remind them that the Korean War took place right after some of the best strategists that we've ever produced as a nation decided to rebalance to Europe. That's what assumptions can do. And we know the cost to soldiers when we get it wrong. We know the cost to soldiers when we're not ready. 7 hours after Task Force Smith made contact, 185 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. Among other things, they could have used the 3.5-inch rocket launchers to stop the North Korean tanks. They had 2.36 rocket launchers, and that's because all the 3.5-inch rocket launchers that were in inventory were going to where we actually needed them, in Europe. So when we gather in venues like this or articulate our requirement for resources on the Hill, like the chiefs recently did before the Senate Armed Services Committee, I think it's absolutely appropriate that we're candid. And I'm going to fully associate myself with General Milley's comments 2 weeks ago before the Senate Armed Services Committee and the comments made by the other chiefs. That said, and something very important that I'd like to say is that your Army, the Joint Force, remains the most capable professional force in the world. We can defend the nation and protect our way of life. We can meet our alliance responsibilities, and we have a competitive advantage over any potential adversary in the world. And I think that's an important point that shouldn't be lost on our enemies. It shouldn't be lost on our allies. It shouldn't be lost on the American people. And most importantly, it shouldn't be lost on the men and women in the Joint Force. I was a platoon commander in the 1970s, and I was a company commander when General Meyer introduced the term Hollow Army in his testimony in May of 1980. And I would tell you, our Joint Force today bears no comparison to a Hollow Army. Not in leadership, not in training, not in equipment, not in the quality of our people. And that's a point of emphasis that I would make, because I wouldn't be, and I want to assure you, I wouldn't be part of anything that would return us back to the kind of force that we had in my early days on active duty. And I'm saying all that in terms of the capability and the credibility of our force today. I'm saying all that fully appreciative of the challenges that each of the services have experienced as a result of fiscal instability and an incredibly high level of operational tempo, 15 years at war. And that's particularly true of the Army, which has been the linchpin of the Joint Force since 9/11. And I use that word deliberately, linchpin, because the Army has literally been the force that has held together the Joint Force with critical command and control capabilities, critical logistics capabilities, and other enablers. And when some people use the word foundation, I don't think that actually captures the role of the Army and the Joint Force. And so I'd offer to you that from my perspective, as I look at it through the lens I look at the services through now, I see it as the linchpin. And I'm not saying that to make you feel good. In any event, we're running hard, and we still have many units today at a 1-to-1 deployment to dwell ratio, and sometimes greater. And it's not just Iraq and Afghanistan that are keeping us busy. I was reminded of that recently when Captain Brian Hotchkiss, a company commander with the 3rd Infantry Division, deployed to Juba, South Sudan, to reinforce our diplomatic presence there. I'd met some of his soldiers last Christmas when they were in Djibouti. His company is part of that regionally aligned brigade that's in AFRICOM. His brigade's out of Fort Stewart. They're operating with about 1,300 soldiers in about 14 different countries across the continent. When they go home, they should feel a tremendous sense of satisfaction for the contribution that they've made on 2 continents during their deployment. I was also reminded of how busy we are when I've met soldiers like Sergeant Major Matt Barrick, and I think he may actually be here today. He's a Special Forces soldier with the 7th Special Forces Group. He's currently training Colombians in both counter-narcotic and human trafficking. In his 19-year career, he's deployed over 20 times to 16 different countries. And I think all of us know that's actually not a unique story in our Army today. As we speak, the Army's got 184,000 soldiers in 140 different countries worldwide. Joe Anderson, is he here, Chief? No, see, he's actually working. He's the G3 of the Army. But he could give you the brief, though. He could talk about soldiers making it matter in Afghanistan. He could talk about soldiers supporting our partners on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Soldiers building relationships and interoperability with our allies and partners in the Pacific and prepared to fight tonight under Vince Brooks' leadership. And soldiers training in the Ukraine while reassuring our allies in deterring Russia. They used to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire. I think it's fair today to say that the sun never sets on the Army of the United States. But that operational tempo has put stress on our people, and particularly on our families. And there's human factor indicators and trends, and the Chief and I have spoken about them. We recognize that they're out there. And we also know our equipment is showing signs of wear and tear. We've exceeded miles on our vehicles, hours on our aircraft, and the readiness challenges have been exacerbated in many cases by significant delays in our modernization programs as a result of tough choices that we've had to make. So my point is, I'm not at all complacent about today's competitive advantage. We do have to restore readiness, and that means recruiting and retaining the right quality people. It means modernizing key systems, delivering rigorous training, revitalizing our infrastructure, and doing something that I think virtually every Army leader this week has spoken about, growing the right leaders that we need for the future. In the end, we have to develop what I describe as comprehensive joint readiness. And the true test for the joint force is our ability to deliver viable and credible options to our National Command Authority in time of a crisis or a contingency. At the end of the day, that's, to me, the metric of success. We've got to maintain also the flexibility to transition from one crisis to another and ensure, and I think this is an important point, and it's what makes the United States different, ensure that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are never in a fair fight. That's not what we seek to do, is to put our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in a fair fight. And doing that is going to require some hard choices, there's no doubt. It's going to require that we adapt the force that we have today to meet today's challenges, even as we innovate towards tomorrow. That's been a theme of the conference this week, and quite honestly, it's a theme on the Joint Staff every day. That's our collective responsibility, and with your help, that's actually, for me, job one over the next few years that I'm your chairman. It's been said many times this week that we live in an incredibly complex and dynamic security environment, and someone no less than Henry Kissinger said that this is the most complex and dynamic security environment since World War II. And I got to tell you, after a year in my current assignment, I'm not going to push back on either Henry Kissinger or the other speakers this week. In fact, I was mindful as I was preparing for this of Carlisle. Interesting enough, when I was a student at the Army War College, I was the exercise chairman for one of the exercises in the spring. And during the exercise, they came at us with 5, 6, 7 different scenarios. You know, at one point I put my hands up, I said, this is BS. This is never going to happen this way. Never going to happen this way. I now realize that General Scales and the faculty at the Army War College when I was there lacked imagination. They lacked it. It's all that they provided to me and much, much more. But although the institutions and the structures that have underpinned the international order since World War II are still largely intact, we are confronted simultaneously with 4 state challenges, of course, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and one non-state challenge in the form of violent extremism. Most of you have heard these referred to as the 4+1. And I just want to share with you what the 4+1 are for me. First of all, it's not predictive in nature. So when I talk about the 4+1, I'm not using that to predict the future. If anything has happened to me in my time on active duty, it's that I have become humble about our ability to predict the future. In fact, you know, when I speak at Capstone, I speak sincerely. I say, you know, when I was a second lieutenant, here was my level of confidence that I had all the answers, and here was my level of experience. And I'm standing before you today, and I say this sincerely. Today, here's my level of confidence that I have all the answers, and here's my level of experience. It's completely inverse. But I have found that the 4+1 is a useful construct to look at the joint force. And here's the assumption I make and it's really an important assumption, and if I don't have it right, this is something that I need to be challenged on. My assumption is that if we look at the 4 state challenges that we have, and I'll share some of the details of that here in a minute, but if we look at these 4 state challenges, and then we look at violent extremism, and we look at where they are today, and we benchmark ourselves against those challenges today, and we look at where they are in terms of their path to capability development 5, 7, 8 years from now, and we use that as a benchmark, and then we kind of look at how we would match up against one or more of these challenges simultaneously. Here's the key assumption I make. My assumption is that we'll get it about right. In other words, we will build about the right inventory of joint capabilities and capacities that will allow us to maintain a competitive advantage. We may not find ourselves dealing with any one of those 4 state challenges in the future, and it may be a challenge that we completely didn't expect. Again, witness Task Force Smith. But we do need something to benchmark ourselves against. We do need something to drive our assessment of risk today, our risk tomorrow. We need something to inform the path for capability development that we are pursuing as a joint force. And so that's, to me, what the 4+1 are. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to run through very quickly each of the 4 state challenges in violent extremism, just to set the stage for what I really believe the most important part of the conversation, and that is what I see as the implications of these 4+1. The first is Russia, and I've said it many times publicly, the Chief has said it, Russia presents the greatest array of challenges and threats to our interests. Despite, they have significant demographic and economic challenges, there's no doubt, but it's equally true that they've been pursuing a path of military capability development and modernization that's virtually unmatched around the world. They're also operating with a frequency in areas that we haven't seen for almost 20 years. When I was a young captain in the Mediterranean aboard Navy ships, routinely we would see the Soviets down there operating with the full capabilities of the Soviet Union. We haven't seen that pattern of operational, that operational pattern for 20 years. We haven't seen that operational pattern that we see now in the North Sea and the Arctic, but we see it now with Russia. We've also seen them modernizing their existing systems and also some capabilities that are particularly concerning to the United States and our interests, their long-range conventional strike, modernized nuclear capabilities, and then focused on developing a wide range of robust cyber, space, electronic warfare, and undersea capabilities. And they're also doing that while continuing to maintain a very capable conventional force. In my judgment, their operational patterns, their capability development, and their behavior are designed to undermine the United States, our ability to project power, and the credibility of our alliances. We have recently concluded the National Military Strategy. It's about ready to be signed and moved on. I got to give the Secretary a chance to look at it, but the chiefs and I have built this from the top down. I'll mention it again in a minute. But as we went through this, we struggled with centers of gravity. We said, what is it that we draw our strength from as a joint force? And with apologies to those at the command and staff colleges that say you have to identify one center of gravity, we landed on 2. One we said was kind of at the strategic level, and that's the network of alliances and partnerships that we've built up over the last 70 years is absolutely a source of strength for the joint force. And then the other source of strength, which won't surprise you, and we've talked about it much this week, I know Dave Perkins has spoken about it, that's our ability as a nation to project power. And in my judgment, when you look at what Russia is doing, both from a capability development perspective and from a political perspective, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute, I think it's focused on those 2 areas, undermining the credibility of our alliances and minimizing, mitigating our power projection capability. In the Pacific, our policy is to seek opportunities to cooperate with China. But from a military perspective, we're also watching very closely the militarization of the South China Sea and East China Sea. And we're looking at China's expansion in their presence, both inside of Asia and outside of Asia. And while their budget and their expenditures in particular are relatively opaque, sometimes it's hard to see exactly what the Chinese are doing, either in a fiscal perspective or in terms of capability development, it's pretty clear that the Chinese leadership has embarked on a very significant program to modernize the nuclear enterprise, their power projection, their space, their cyber, ballistic missile, and defense capabilities. And similar to Russia, what I believe is that China seeks to do the same thing in the Pacific that Russia seeks to do, which has undermined the credibility of our alliances and partnerships in the Pacific, while at the same time minimizing our ability to move into the Pacific from a power projection perspective or operate within the Pacific. North Korea's behavior and capability development continues to threaten our allies and, as we've seen recently, potentially at homeland. We've seen the recent efforts to develop cyber, ballistic missile, and nuclear capabilities. And the Iranian regime aims to establish itself as the dominant regional power in the Middle East, and I describe the major export of the Iranians as malign influence as they support terrorist organizations across the region while modernizing an impressive array of maritime, ballistic missile, again, space, cyber, and cruise missile capabilities. And finally, we continue to grapple with the challenge of violent extremism, and that includes the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and associated groups. It is, as we all know, a trans-regional threat, and we're continually developing our ability to disrupt external attacks and enhance our ability to deal with the problem trans-regionally. I don't have time to discuss it today, but over the past year, one of our focuses has been to try to bring some coherence to all of our regional efforts against violent extremism. And with SOCOM's lead, I think we've come up with a much more effective framework to do that. If you think about it, each of the combatant commanders either is sitting on top of a coalition. In the case of the United States Central Command, that's true, or regional efforts to deal with the terrorist threat, violent extremism, and you see that from West Africa to Southeast Asia. Our focus now is to try to deal with the trans-regional threat trans-regionally, to prioritize and allocate resources in a global way, and again, to bring some coherence, and I'm particularly appreciative of what SOCOM has done to help us move towards that. Work to do, but we're getting there. Well, we all realize that this is a long-term proposition. I'm pretty encouraged by the progress that we've made on the ground in Iraq and Syria over the past year. And I would just say parenthetically, and not just because I'm speaking to this crowd, I think we can all be proud of the leadership, starting with James Terry and going on to Sean McFarland and going to Steve Townsend today in the great force that they have led over the last 2 years. What I have said to people, you know, if we were having, last year, if I had been a speaker here at AUSA, and you said, what would you want the situation on the ground to be next year, I don't think I could have asked for something better than what we're seeing right now, the progress that's made over the last year. And again, it isn't just what took place over the past year. It was the foundational work that was done to build partnership capacity, develop the intel network, develop the infrastructure that we are now leveraging to start to push back on the Islamic State. Again, more work needs to be done, and we're no means complacent, but I think we're getting after this permutation of violent extremism pretty well. And frankly, when I look at our efforts in West Africa, in Libya, and under Mick Nicholson's leadership in Afghanistan, I see similar results. But now, you know, to kind of move forward, and the challenges that I see when I look at those 4 state challenges in violent extremism have a number of implications for the joint force. And the first one is foundational, and that is we need a balanced inventory of capabilities with sufficient capacity that allows us to deter and defeat potential adversaries across the range of military operations. As a nation that has to think and act globally, we don't have the luxury of choosing between a force that can fight ISIL and one that can deter and defeat a peer adversary. Nor do we have the luxury of choosing between meeting our current operational requirements and developing the capabilities we'll need to meet tomorrow. I read General Ham's article that was published on Monday. I've listened to some of the speakers. That's been a constant theme, the need to balance today's requirements with the need to grow the force that we will need tomorrow. And getting that balance right, in my judgment, will be one of our more significant challenges in the next few years. In this crowd, I don't have to say much about the fiscal environment. The Bipartisan Budget Act may get us through FY17, but we still have $100 billion of sequestration looming, and we've got literally, and we've used this phrase, but it's true, we have a bow wave of modernization requirements that are going to have to be addressed over the next couple of years. And while predictable and sufficient funding are part of the equation, and we need both of those, and both the Chief and I have banged that home many times before the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee, we're going to have to do more than buy hardware in the days ahead. We're going to have to expend some intellectual capital and develop disruptive and innovative ways to meet our requirements. And I have come to paraphrase, and I like the expression that Winston Churchill is attributed, it's attributed to Winston Churchill, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of money, now it's time to think. A second implication for us to consider is to most effectively use the military instrument of national power to address today's challenges. I believe we need to develop more effective methods to deal with what we've seen of Russian behavior in the Crimea, in Georgia, in the Ukraine, what we've seen of Iranian malign influence across the Middle East, and again, what we've seen of China's activity in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Each of those nations have leveraged economic coercion, political influence, information operations, unconventional operations, and military posture to advance their national interests. I refer to that, and some use the term hybrid or gray zone. I've specifically not done that because both terms have become laden with baggage. I refer to that as adversarial competition that has a military dimension but falls short of actual armed conflict. So adversarial competition with a military dimension. In our traditional approach is to think about whether we're at peace or at war. And meanwhile, our adversaries don't think about things that way. It's for that reason that I don't actually find the current construct that we have, for example, with operation plans, particularly useful. Again, if you think about shaping and you think about conflict, you would bin all of your activities, your authorities, and your capabilities into one of the bins. You're either shaping or you're fighting. Our adversaries are unconstrained by that methodology. In fact, I can share with you an anecdote. In November of last year, I was in the job about a month, and we had all the combatant commanders convene down at Quantico. We had a large map in a gymnasium to kind of talk about the joint force and frankly, how we would prioritize and allocate resources in the event of a specific scenario. And I asked General Phil Breedlove, a good friend for a long time, I said, Phil, what phase are you in right now in Europe? And he looked at me a bit confused and he said, well, we're in phase 0. And I said, all right, what phase would you assess Russia is in right now in Europe? And he said, I don't know, probably phase 2 or 2.5. And then I asked Admiral Harris the same question. I said, Harry, how about the Chinese? What phase are they in? He said, on a daily basis, we see activities, authorities, capabilities being employed that are probably more closely associated to phase 2 than phase 0. And then rhetorically, of course, I asked the question, how long can we have our competitors in phase 2 or 2.5 while we remain in phase 0 and maintain a competitive edge? I think we also need to develop a framework within which to deter cyber threats. And clearly, many in this room know that some of the challenges include attributing threats, managing escalation, and hardening ourselves against a cyber threat. You know, earlier, and I'll just make a comment about resilience. Earlier, when I spoke about one of the important deliverables of the Joint Force being to deliver credible and capable options to the National Command Authority in times of crisis, I have come in this job to look at resilience as an incredibly important thing, because the resilience of the platform from which we project power actually has a lot to do with the options that we're going to be able to provide the National Command Authority in a crisis. And when you think about tools that we can employ, you know, it's very difficult to start thinking aggressively about employing offensive tools if we haven't addressed the foundational elements of defending the network in the event that the enemy responds in kind. And so I would just say that of the areas, there's many areas that would keep all of us awake at night. That issue of resilience, that one example, cyber being one of many, but that issue of resilience is one that I pay attention to. I would just say that one of the more significant implications of the current trends in the security environment is the high likelihood that any future conflict is going to be transregional, multi-domain, and multifunctional. And while multi-domain conflict is by no means new, and I'm not advertising it as such, advances in electronic warfare, information operations, cyber activities, space operations, ballistic missile technology have all made the character of war today extraordinarily dynamic. And we're going to see capabilities like that. We see capabilities like that today fielded by both state and non-state actors, and they know exactly how to employ those tools to exploit our vulnerabilities. You know, about 18 months ago, I had a chance to visit Dave Perkins and H.R. McMaster down at TRADOC, and I've read the Army operating concept, and we spoke about it a lot that day. And I know the Army is getting after this whole idea of multi-domain conflict in a pretty aggressive way at the operational level. What I'd like to do, maybe just share with you through the lens I'm looking at it, is it's a little bit different at the strategic level, but there are some similarities. In my mind, there's some strategic implications with conflicts that are going to quickly spread across multiple combatant commands that are, in fact, multi-domain and multifunctional. And the current fight against violent extremism is just one such example where you see a trans-regional, multi-domain fight. But the example that I have come to use, because it illustrates it well for me, is the North Korea scenario. And we got General Sharp here and many others who have served in Korea. General Thurman is here. But I use the North Korea threat because it drives home for me the point I'm trying to make. If you think about it, in the 1990s, we had a regional strategy, and I think we had a fundamental assumption that if a conflict broke out in the Korean Peninsula, we could manage that within the region, if not within the Korean Peninsula. And that was certainly our effort with ground forces supported by aviation and maritime forces. But then as North Korea developed ballistic missiles, we start now to involve the platforms from which we project power in the Pacific to include Japan. And that now makes it clearly a regional fight. And then as North Korea develops cyber capabilities, space capabilities, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, now I think I would assume that a conflict in the Korean Peninsula very quickly is not just multi-domain, but it's multi-domain and trans-regional. And so the example I would use is I'd say, look, if a fight breaks out in the peninsula, yes, General Brooks is engaged. Yes, Admiral Harris is engaged, but so is General Robinson in NORTHCOM, so is Admiral Haney at Strategic Command, so is Mike Rogers at Cyber Command. And who for a minute thinks that if something like that happens on the Korean Peninsula, we're going to be able to afford to come to all stop and do student body left over to the Korean Peninsula, that something else won't be going on simultaneously. In the context of that dynamic, I don't believe our planning, our organizational, or our command and control constructs are optimized for the current fight or for the fight that we're going to face in the future. You know, again, today we kind of basically have a regionally focused construct. In an execution, and this is an important point, I think, in execution, and we ought to be proud of this, we rely on cooperation and collaboration across combatant commanders in supporting relationships. And I think that's worked for decades, but my argument is that if you think about that North Korean scenario and you think about simultaneity and you think about violent extremism and all those things happen at the same time, the lowest level of integration from an authority's perspective in the Department of Defense is the Secretary of Defense. And I think he's going to need more support than he currently has to make decisions with those factors of time and space, and again, the character war as I see it in the 21st century at the strategic level. And for that reason, I mentioned the National Military Strategy earlier. It's a classified document this year, and the reason it is to frame these problems I just spoke about and provide a framework within which we can integrate the joint force from the very beginning. And the one thing I say is the aggregation of operations plans is not a strategy. What we should do is go from policy to a strategic framework for some of these problem sets like Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. That strategic framework then informs combatant commanders' theater campaign plans in their old plans. And we're also working to develop a more effective command and control construct to facilitate decision making. Here's my point. We don't have, you've talked mission command this week quite a bit, we don't have mission command today at the strategic level in the United States. More importantly, we haven't set the fundamental conditions that are necessary to establish mission command. And we're getting after that, and I'll have more on that in the coming weeks. Before I close, I just want to quickly shift to the Army specifically and talk about your biggest challenges. And again, I think in the broadest sense, what General Ham said earlier this week in terms of the balance between today and tomorrow is right on the mark. And from my perspective, the near-term challenge, obviously, is to restore the full spectrum readiness that the chiefs talked about, even as we meet op-tempo requirements, the combatant commanders' requirements. And you're tackling that, and General Milley has rightly made that his #1 priority in making progress. And I think I recognize that in the way you've set up your training, the way you've leveraged the Guard and Reserve components, in the way you've prioritized leader development. Again, looking at the remarks that have been made by my predecessors this week, almost every one of them has talked about those areas. I think General Milley would be the first to tell you that progress has come at a cost. And in order to maintain that high level of readiness, we have taken a hiatus on modernization. I think we have accepted risk downstream. And that's why I think the long-term challenge for the Army and really for the entire joint force is to kind of reset that balance. And this is probably one of the key points I wanted to make today. I think if you look back over the last 4 years, we made two assumptions. 4 years ago when we were trying to deal with the budget. We assumed that the operational tempo would reduce. Our operational requirements would go down. And we also assumed that the budget situation would get better. I'm here to tell you, as we grapple with the future challenges, I would offer to you that those assumptions have only exacerbated the fiscal challenge we've had. And if I were to make two assumptions today, I'd make them this way. I'd say, number one, I don't believe, there's no indication for me, sitting where I sit, that our operational requirements are going to be reduced. I don't see that. Nor do I actually see us enjoying an increase in the resources that are going to be available to us. I don't see that. We may avoid sequestration, but if you look at historical trends, I don't see our top line significantly increasing. So I think over the next couple of years, the chief, the secretary, the leadership team that's here, we're going to have to make some pretty tough choices, and he's going to need the whole team to get it right. And I won't give you too much advice today. The first advice I'll give you, and the chief's heard me talk about this before, is we can't afford inside our Army what I describe as the 3 Ps. Being possessive, being parochial, or being pedantic are not going to be helpful over the next couple of years as we deal with these challenges. And we've worked through these as an Army before. There's no doubt about it. And the innovation that we talk about now, the innovation that we need, the kind of thinking that we need, has been a hallmark of the Army for a long time. In the 1920s, we saw it when George Marshall took the lessons learned from World War I and set the conditions for the Army to be successful in World War II. In the 1960s, there was an old cavalryman that worked on cavalry doctrine that really informed the way that we did business in Vietnam. And after Vietnam, and there's a number of them here right now, there was a generation of leaders that rebuilt our Army, rebuilt it from a training perspective, from a capability development perspective, from a doctrine perspective, and as importantly, from a leadership development perspective. And each of these examples has, I think, some common themes. One is combat-tested leaders. 2 is they leveraged existing technologies. 3 is they worked with industry partners and joint partners, and they adapted the way they think, the way they thought, in order to develop a breakthrough in how we fight. So they changed the way they thought, and it influenced how we fought. They changed the way we thought, and they influenced how we fought. And I think that really, at the end of the day, is the legacy of innovation in our Army. It's in your DNA, and you're always focused on looking at tomorrow, not yesterday. And I think that's particularly true today, because one of my expressions is, you can be sure as the Army of the United States that you will get no credit tomorrow for what you did yesterday. I'm going to close by telling you that I do recognize the challenges that we have inside the Army. I recognize the challenges that the Chief has outlined in terms of readiness. But I also would say that we still have the best Army in the world, and our job is now to make sure that even as we meet the requirements, the incredible requirements we're putting in our Army today, that we have a half an eye towards tomorrow, and we're able to do 2 things at once. They were able to do that in the 1920s. They were able to do that in the late 1950s and 1960s. They were able to do that in the 1980s, and we are equally capable of doing that today. And because I have such confidence in our ability to do that, I just want to tell you that I am incredibly proud to have had the opportunity to be here today at AUSA, proud that my friend General Ham invited me to be here, but proud every day to wear this uniform alongside those who are in this room, and more importantly, those you represent. God bless you, and thanks very much.
We're just going to take a moment, and not very often you get the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Dixon Award together, so we're going to do a photo op, if that's okay. Why don't we do this? Is that okay?
So we step up here?
They can get us.